The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across Margaret Whittaker's throat as Ruth Daniels approached with the silver wine pitcher, her bare feet silent against the polished oak floors. The harvest festival was in full swing around them, violins weaving through laughter and conversation, but Ruth's eyes remained fixed on that pale exposed neck. In her apron pocket, the kitchen knife felt warm against her trembling fingers. Margaret never saw it coming, never felt the blade until it was far too late. And by the time the screams began, Ruth was already walking calmly toward the back door, leaving bloody footprints on the marble steps. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning of October 15, 1852, dawned crisp and golden over Savannah's historic district, where the Whittaker mansion stood like a testament to Southern prosperity. Ruth Daniels had been awake since 4 in the morning, her calloused hands already deep in bread, when the first light crept through the kitchen windows. She was 26 years old, though the plantation records listed her as property rather than person, valued at $800 alongside the horses and livestock. Her dark skin bore the faint scars of childhood punishments. Thin white lines that caught the lamplight when she moved, reminders of lessons learned too early about keeping her place in this world of rigid hierarchies and unspoken rules. The harvest festival had been planned for months, an annual tradition that brought together Savannah's elite families to celebrate another profitable season. Margaret Whittaker, Ruth's mistress, had spent weeks selecting her gown, a deep emerald silk that complemented her auburn hair and emphasized her status as one of the city's most fashionable women. At 32, Margaret possessed the kind of beauty that opened doors and loosened purse strings. Her husband's shipping fortune, providing the perfect backdrop for her social ambitions. She moved through their world with practiced grace, never doubting her place at the top of society's carefully constructed pyramid. Ruth had watched Margaret prepare for countless such events over the past 8 years, since being purchased from the Charleston slave market and brought to serve in the Whittaker household. She had learned to anticipate her mistress's needs to appear with fresh linens before being asked to remain invisible, yet indispensable. The other house slaves whispered that Ruth was fortunate to work indoors away from the brutal sun and back-breaking labor of the fields, but fortune felt relative when measured against freedom itself. The kitchen bustled with activity as Ruth directed the preparation of elaborate dishes for the evening's festivities. Cornish hen stuffed with wild rice, sweet potato soul, and her famous pecan pie that had earned grudging praise even from visiting dignitaries. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent her days creating beauty and sustenance for people who viewed her as less than human. Her culinary skills adding value to her master's reputation, while she herself remained nameless cattle in their conversations. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the cobblestone courtyard, guests began arriving in ornate carriages, their horses stamping impatiently while livery drivers waited in respectful silence. The men wore their finest tail coats and pristine white gloves, while ladies rustled through the front door in cascades of silk and taffeta, their jewelry catching the light from countless candles that had been lit throughout the mansion's public rooms. Ruth moved between them like a shadow, refilling glasses and clearing plates, her presence acknowledged only when service was needed. The evening's entertainment centered around the grand ballroom, where a small orchestra had been positioned beneath towering windows that overlooked the manicured gardens. Couples swayed to waltzes and country dances, their laughter mixing with the clink of crystal and the soft shuffle of dancing slippers against polished wood. Ruth found herself stationed near the refreshment table, keeping vigilant watch over the wine service and ensuring that no glass remained empty for long. Margaret held court near the fireplace, her green gown shimmering as she gestured animatedly while recounting some gossip about Charleston society. Her husband Charles Whittaker stood nearby with a group of businessmen. Their conversation focused on cotton prices and shipping schedules. Ruth had overheard enough of these discussions over the years to understand the economics that kept her in bondage, the calculations that reduced human lives to profit margins and inventory assessments. The moment that would change everything began with something seemingly insignificant. Margaret, flushed from dancing and slightly intoxicated from champagne, gestured toward Ruth with dismissive irritation. The wine glasses are spotted, she announced loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Honestly, you simply cannot find decent help these days. The standards have become absolutely appalling." Ruth felt the familiar burn of humiliation rise in her chest, but kept her expression neutral as she began collecting the offending glassware. She had endured thousands of such moments over the years, each one a small death of dignity, a reminder that her humanity counted for nothing in this world of privilege and power. But tonight felt different. Perhaps because of the knife she had impulsively slipped into her apron pocket earlier that afternoon while preparing vegetables for the evening's meal. The blade was nothing special, just a common kitchen knife with a worn wooden handle and an edge kept sharp through daily use. Ruth's grandmother had taught her to keep her knives properly maintained back when she was still a child on the rice plantation near Charleston, before the family debts forced her sale and separation from everything familiar. The weight of the knife against her hip felt like a secret, a possibility that had been growing stronger with each passing humiliation. As the evening progressed, Ruth found herself studying Margaret with new intensity, noting how her mistress threw back her head when laughing, exposing the pale column of her throat, how she moved with unconscious arrogance through spaces that others had cleaned and prepared for her comfort, how she accepted service as her natural due, never considering the human cost of her luxury. The more Ruth observed, the more she felt something cold and determined settling in her chest, displacing the familiar ache of resignation that had been her constant companion for so many years. The harvest moon hung full and bright outside the ballroom windows, casting silver light across the dancing couples as the orchestra transitioned into a slower, more intimate melody. Ruth moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, her dark dress and white apron rendering her nearly invisible among the colorful gowns and formal attire of the guests. She carried a fresh pitcher of wine, the silver surface reflecting the candle light as she made her rounds, topping off glasses and accepting nods of acknowledgement that fell just short of actual recognition. Margaret had claimed a seat in a high-backed chair near the musicians, fanning herself delicately while accepting compliments on her gown and her skill as a hostess. Her cheeks were pink from the warmth of the room and the effects of alcohol, and she seemed more animated than usual, perhaps caught up in the success of her evening's entertainment. Ruth approached with the wine pitcher, moving with the quiet difference that had become second nature over the years of service. "More wine, Mrs. Whitaker." Ruth's voice was soft, carefully modulated to blend into the background of conversation and music. Margaret glanced up with the vague, unfocused attention she typically paid to servants, extending her glass without really looking at Ruth's face. In that moment of casual dismissal, something fundamental shifted in Ruth's perception of her circumstances. The knife slid from her apron pocket with surprising ease, the familiar weight settling into her palm as if it belonged there. Ruth had handled this particular blade hundreds of times in the course of her kitchen duties, knew exactly how much pressure was needed to slice through different materials, understood the physics of sharp steel meeting resistance. Her grandmother's voice echoed across the ears, reminding her that every tool had its purpose, every action its consequence. Margaret lifted the wine glass to her lips, tilting her head back slightly to savor the vintage that had been imported specifically for this evening's celebration. The motion stretched the skin of her neck taut, revealing the delicate tracery of veins beneath the surface, the vulnerable spot where pulse beat steadily beneath pearl earrings and expensive perfume. Ruth moved closer, ostensibly to provide more attentive service, her movement still smooth and unremarkable to anyone who might be watching. The blade moved with swift precision across Margaret's throat, opening a line that bloomed red against pale skin before the wine glass had time to fall from suddenly nerveless fingers. The cut was deep and sure, severing the carotid artery with the same efficiency Ruth had used to dress countless chickens and prepare innumerable meals in the Whitaker kitchen. Blood spread across the emerald silk in a pattern that might have been beautiful if viewed from a different context, like abstract art painted in crimson against expensive fabric. Margaret's eyes widened with shock and confusion, her hands fluttering toward her throat in a futile attempt to stem the flow that was already beyond any earthly help. She tried to speak, perhaps to call for assistance or demand an explanation, but only managed a wet, gurgling sound that was quickly drowned out by the continued music and conversation around them. The other guests remained focused on their own entertainment, unaware that their hostess was dying just a few feet away from their dancing and laughter. Ruth stepped back slightly, watching with detached fascination as life ebbed from Margaret's eyes. There was no satisfaction in the moment, no sense of triumph for revenge completed. Instead, she felt a strange emptiness, as if some essential part of herself had been severed along with her mistress's throat. The knife remained in her hand, dark with blood, that dripped steadily onto the polished floor, creating a pattern that reminded her of the spilled wine that had once earned her a beating for carelessness. The first scream came from Elizabeth Morrison, a banker's wife, who had turned to compliment Margaret on her choice of wines, and instead discovered the gruesome scene. The sound pierced through the music and conversation like a blade itself, causing couples to pause in their dancing and heads to turn toward the source of distress. Elizabeth's face had gone white with shock. One gloved hand pressed to her mouth as she stared at Margaret's still form and the spreading pool of blood that reflected the candle light like a dark mirror. Chaos erupted through the ballroom as other guests noticed the horror that had unfolded in their midst. Women shrieked and fainted, their elaborate gowns rustling as they collapsed onto the floor or into their husbands' arms. Men shouted for doctors and constables, though anyone with medical training could see immediately that help come far too late for Margaret Whittaker. Charles rushed forward, his face a mask of disbelief in growing rage as he knelt beside his wife's body and tried unsuccessfully to find signs of life. Ruth remained standing beside the chair, where Margaret had died, the bloody knife still held loosely in her right hand. She felt curiously calm amid the pandemonium surrounding her, as if she were watching events unfold from a great distance rather than standing at their center. Several of the male guests had begun moving toward her, their faces showing a mixture of fear and anger, but she made no attempt to flee or defend herself. The deed was done, the choice made, and carried through to its inevitable conclusion. "Murderer!" Charles's voice rose above the screams and shouts, his face twisted with grief and fury as he pointed an accusatory finger at Ruth. "Seize her. Don't let that devil escape." But Ruth had no intention of running. She had spent 8 years in this house, knew every corridor and hiding place, every entrance and exit. If she had wanted to flee, she could have been gone before the first scream echoed through the ballroom. Instead, she carefully set the knife down on the small table beside Margaret's chair, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The blood on her hands had begun to dry, leaving dark stains against her brown skin that would mark her as surely as any brand. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, noting how quickly their expressions had shifted from shock to hatred, how fear had transformed elegant society into something primitive and dangerous. "Why?" The question came from Dr. Harrison, a family friend who had been among the first to reach Margaret's side. His voice carried genuine bewilderment along with horror, as if he truly could not comprehend what had driven a house slave to commit such an act against her mistress. Ruth met his eyes steadily, searching for words that might explain 8 years of accumulated humiliation, a lifetime of being treated as property rather than person, the slow erosion of hope that had finally crystallized in this moment of terrible action. But what words could bridge the gulf between their experiences, between his comfortable assumptions about the natural order of things and her lived reality of subjugation and denial? How could she explain the weight of invisible chains? The daily assault on dignity that came with being owned rather than employed, the gradual understanding that freedom would never be granted, but must be seized regardless of the cost. "She was never kind," Ruth said finally, her voice carrying clearly through the shocked silence that had fallen over the ballroom. The simple statement seemed to hang in the air like an indictment, challenging the gathered guests to examine their own complicity in a system that reduced human beings to commodities. Several people gasped at what they perceived as inadequate justification for murder, but Ruth felt no need to elaborate or defend her actions further. Charles lunged toward her with violence in his eyes, but was restrained by 2 other men who recognized the danger of allowing him to act on his immediate rage. "Hang her," he shouted, his voice breaking with emotion. "Hang her from the nearest tree." The crowd murmured agreement, their civilized veneer stripped away by the proximity of violence and the violation of their assumed safety. Ruth had shattered more than just Margaret's life. She had challenged the fundamental assumptions that allowed their world to function. Yet, even as voices called for immediate vengeance, Ruth found herself thinking about her grandmother's stories of Africa. Tales passed down through generations, despite every attempt to erase such memories. Stories of warriors and queens, of people who chose death over dishonor, who understood that some things were more valuable than mere survival. Perhaps this was her inheritance, finally claiming its due. The blood of proud ancestors, asserting itself after years of enforced submission, the constables arrived within minutes, summoned by servants who had been dispatched into the night as soon as the magnitude of the situation became clear. They entered the ballroom with drawn weapons, expecting to find a dangerous criminal who might resist arrest, but found instead a woman standing quietly beside her victim, her hands folded in front of her as if waiting for Sunday's service to begin. The contrast between their expectations and reality seemed to unsettle them more than outright defiance might have done. "Come along, girl," the lead constable said, producing iron shackles that had clearly been designed for restraining slaves rather than ordinary criminals. The metal was heavy and crude, worn smooth by contact with countless wrists and ankles over the years of their use. Ruth extended her hands without resistance, feeling the cold iron close around her wrists with a finality that seemed to echo through her bones. As they led her from the ballroom, Ruth took one last look at the scene she had created. Margaret's body remained in the chair where she had died, her green gown now more black than emerald in the candlelight, her carefully arranged hair disheveled by her final moments. The other guests had drawn back to create a wide circle around the corpse, as if death itself might be contagious, their faces showing the kind of fascinated horror typically reserved for carriage, accidents, and public executions. The night air felt cool against Ruth's face as they emerged from the overheated ballroom into the courtyard where carriages waited to take guests away from this nightmare disruption of their carefully ordered world. She could hear voices behind her, already beginning to construct the narrative that would make sense of what had happened, transforming her from a human being driven to desperate action into a cautionary tale about the dangers of insufficient control over the enslaved population. The jail cell was exactly what Ruth had expected, a small stone room with a single barred window that provided minimal light and less comfort. The floor was covered with moldy straw that suggested previous occupants, and the walls bore scratches and stains that spoke of desperation and despair. She settled onto the narrow wooden bench that served as both seat and bed, her shackled hands resting in her lap, as she contemplated the choices that had led her to this place. Outside, she could hear the sounds of a city beginning to buzz with news of the evening's events. Footsteps hurried past on cobblestone streets, voices raised in excited conversation as words spread from house to house about the murder that had shocked Savannah's elite. Ruth knew that her story would be told and retold, each version probably straying further from the truth, until she became more symbol than person, a representation of whatever fears or assumptions the tellers brought to their back. Narrative. The trial was scheduled for the following week. Though everyone understood that legal proceedings would be little more than formality, the law regarding slaves who murdered their masters was clear and unambiguous, the punishment prescribed without possibility of mitigation or appeal. Ruth would hang, probably within days of her conviction, and her body would likely be displayed as a warning to others who might harbor similar thoughts of rebellion. Yet, as she sat in her cell listening to the sounds of free people going about their daily business, Ruth found that she felt no regret for her actions. The weight that had pressed on her chest for so many years was gone, replaced by something that might have been peace if circumstances had been different. She had acted according to her own will, for perhaps the first time in her adult life had asserted her humanity in the most fundamental way possible, by refusing to accept her assigned role as passive victim. The days that followed her arrest passed quickly, marked by visits from lawyers and ministers who seemed more interested in understanding her motives than in providing actual assistance. They asked the same questions repeatedly, seeking some explanation that would fit their preconceptions about slave psychology and criminal behavior. Ruth answered honestly when she felt inclined to speak at all, but found that truth seemed to disturb them more than comfortable lies might have done. Dr. Harrison visited on the third day, still wearing the expression of bewildered confusion that had marked his face in the ballroom. He was a kind man by the standards of his time and place, someone who had always treated his own slaves with what he considered appropriate benevolence. Ruth's actions challenged his understanding of the relationship between master and servant, forced him to confront the possibility that kindness alone might not be sufficient to maintain a system built on human burls. Ownership. "I still don't understand," he said, settling onto the wooden stool that had been provided for visitors. "Margaret fed you well, clothed you properly, never used the whip. You had a better situation than most of your kind. Why throw it all away for a moment of madness?" His voice carried genuine puzzlement, as if he truly believed that adequate food and shelter should have been enough to ensure loyalty and gratitude. Ruth studied his face in the dim light that filtered through the barred window, noting the sincere confusion that marked his features. He was not a cruel man, not someone who took pleasure in others' suffering, but his compassion was limited by assumptions he had never thought to question. How could she explain that kindness without freedom was still imprisonment? That being well-treated property was still being property rather than person. "Would you be grateful for a comfortable cage, Dr. Harrison?" she asked finally. "Would good food and warm clothing make you forget that you were not free to leave, not permitted to make choices about your own life?" The questions hung in the air between them, challenging him to imagine himself in circumstances he had never seriously considered from a personal perspective. The trial proceeded exactly as everyone had expected, with testimony from witnesses who confirmed the basic facts of Margaret's murder and Ruth's immediate responsibility for the crime. The defense attorney assigned to her case went through the motions of legal representation, but offered no real challenge to the prosecution's narrative. Ruth sat quietly through the proceedings, her shackled hands folded in her lap, listening to her life and actions being reduced to legal terminology and precedent. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning with their inevitable verdict. Guilty of murder in the first degree, with a recommendation for immediate execution. The judge pronounced sentence in a voice heavy with moral authority, speaking of justice and the need to maintain social order to send a clear message about the consequences of violence against one's betters. Ruth listened without visible emotion, though something inside her recoiled at the assumption that Margaret had been her better in any sense beyond mere legal status. But the story did not end with legal proceedings and official pronouncements. On the night before her scheduled execution, Ruth simply vanished from her locked cell, leaving behind only her shackles and a lingering mystery that would puzzle investigators for decades to come. The guards swore that no one had entered or left the jail, that the locks remained secure, and the bars undamaged. Yet, when morning came, the cell stood empty except for the iron chains that had held her, and a small pile of straw that might have been arranged to suggest a human form in the darkness. Search parties scoured the countryside for weeks, following every lead and rumor, checking every possible hiding place where an escaped slave might seek shelter. Bloodhounds were brought in to track her scent, but the trail seemed to end at the jail cell door, as if she had simply evaporated into the night air. Rewards were posted, informants questioned, but no trace of Ruth Daniels was ever found, despite the intensive efforts of law enforcement and the considerable resources devoted to her recapture. Some claimed to have seen her in the months and years that followed, always at night, always alone, walking the roads that led away from Savannah toward destinations unknown. A figure in a dark dress, moving with purposeful stride past roads where four paths met, her bare feet silent against packed earth, her face turned toward stars that had guided other travelers to freedom in times past. But these sightings were never confirmed, never led to actual capture or concrete evidence of her continued existence. The legend grew with time and telling as legends do, accumulating details and significance that transcended the simple facts of murder and escape. Ruth became a ghost story told to frighten children, a cautionary tale about the dangers of insufficient vigilance over the enslaved population, a symbol of resistance that inspired some and terrified others. Her name was whispered in slave quarters throughout the South, carried by networks of communication that operated beneath the notice of their masters. Years passed and the Civil War came to Georgia with fire and destruction that transformed the social order Ruth had challenged with her single act of violence. The Whittaker mansion was burned during Sherman's march to the sea, its elegant rooms reduced to blackened ruins where weeds grew through broken foundations. Charles Whittaker died of fever in 1863, his shipping fortune lost to Union blockades and Confederate currency that became worthless paper in the aftermath of defeat. The old world of plantation society crumbled into memory, replaced by new forms of oppression and new struggles for human dignity. But still, the stories persisted about Ruth Daniels, the slave woman who had killed her mistress and vanished into legend. Some said her spirit walked the roads on autumn nights, seeking others who needed the courage to choose freedom over safety, to act according to their own will rather than others' expectations. In the 1920s, a folklorist collecting stories in rural Georgia recorded an account from an elderly woman whose grandmother had known Ruth personally. According to this source, Ruth had not died in her jail cell, but had been helped to escape by members of the Underground Railroad, who recognized her as a powerful symbol of resistance. She had made her way north to Canada, the story claimed, where she lived quietly under an assumed name until her natural death many years later. Other versions suggested more mystical explanations for her disappearance, tying her story to older traditions of conjure and folk magic that had survived the Middle Passage and taken root in New World soil. These accounts portrayed Ruth as someone who had called upon ancestral powers to break her physical chains, transforming herself into something that existed between the world of the living and the realm of spirits. Whether literal truth or metaphorical expression of deeper truths, such stories served important functions in communities that needed hope and inspiration to survive their own struggles. The Harvest Festival tradition continued in Savannah for several decades after the Civil War, though without the lavish displays of wealth that had characterized the antebellum versions. The social elite who had gathered in the Whittaker ballroom was scattered by economic upheaval and social transformation, their carefully constructed hierarchy dismantled by historical forces beyond their control. But memory persisted in other forms, carried by people who had served at those gatherings and witnessed the moment when one woman's desperation overcame her fear. Contemporary historians studying the incident have found little concrete evidence to support any particular version of Ruth's story beyond the basic facts of Margaret Whittaker's murder and her killer's mysterious Bath disappearance. Court records confirm the trial and conviction. Newspaper accounts provide details about the crime scene and investigation, but the woman herself remains largely invisible in official documentation. Like most enslaved people, she existed primarily in the margins of written history, her own voice and perspective filtered through the accounts of others who viewed her through the lens of their own assumptions and biases. Yet perhaps that invisibility is itself significant. A reminder of how many stories remain untold, how many acts of resistance and courage have been forgotten or distorted by those who held the power to control. Historical narrative. Ruth Daniels may have vanished from her jail cell, but her story endures as testimony to the human capacity for choosing dignity over survival, for asserting individual will against overwhelming systemic oppression. The autumn of 2023 brought renewed interest in Ruth's story when construction workers renovating a historic building in downtown Savannah discovered a small cache of items hidden beneath floorboards that had not been disturbed for more than a century. Among the artifacts was a kitchen knife with a worn wooden handle wrapped in cloth that had once been white but had aged to the color of old bone. Carbon dating suggested the items had been placed in their hiding spot sometime during the mid-1850s, though no definitive connection to Ruth Daniels could be established. Local historians and members of the African Amin community organized a memorial service to honor Ruth and countless others whose stories had been erased from official records. The ceremony took place at a crossroads on the outskirts of town, where four paths met beneath ancient oak trees draped with Spanish moss. Participants spoke about the continuing relevance of Ruth's choice, the ongoing struggle for human dignity and recognition, the importance of remembering those who had paid the ultimate price for asserting their beat. Fundamental humanity. As evening fell and the memorial concluded, several attendees reported seeing a figure in dark clothing walking along one of the paths that led away from the crossroads. The apparition was visible for only a moment before disappearing into shadows cast by overhanging branches. But those who glimpsed it described a woman moving with purposeful stride. Her face turned toward the horizon where freedom waited for those brave enough to seek it. Whether Ruth Daniels died in 1852 or lived for many years beyond her escape, whether her disappearance was accomplished through human agency or supernatural intervention, her story continues to resonate with contemporary audiences who understand the ongoing struggle for justice and human dignity. She remains a powerful symbol of resistance, a reminder that even those who seem powerless can choose to act according to their own moral compass, rather than accepting the roles assigned to them by others. The harvest moon still rises over Savannah each October, casting the same silver light that illuminated the ballroom where Margaret Whittaker died, and Ruth Daniels chose freedom over submission. In that light, some say you can still see her walking the old roads that lead away from the city, her bare feet silent against packed earth, her face turned toward stars that have guided travelers to freedom across centuries of struggle and hope. Her story lives on in the hearts of those who understand that true liberation sometimes requires the courage to sacrifice everything for the sake of asserting one's fundamental humanity. And so the legend endures, passed down through generations who recognize in Ruth Daniels a kindred spirit, someone who understood that there are circumstances under which death is preferable to continued enslavement. Moments when the only meaningful choice is between dignity and survival. Her knife may have ended Margaret Whittaker's life, but it also severed the chains that had bound Ruth's soul, setting her free to walk whatever path she chose, whether in this world or the next. The story of Ruth Daniels reminds us that history is written not only by those who hold official power, but also by individuals who choose to act according to their own moral understanding, regardless of consequences. In her moment of terrible decision, she asserted her humanity against a system that denied it, claimed her right to choose, even when all choices led to destruction, and in doing so achieved a kind of freedom that no law or custom could revoke. Her legacy lives on in every person who refuses to accept injustice as inevitable, who chooses to act according to conscience rather than convenience, who understands that true freedom sometimes requires the ultimate couple sacrifice. Ruth Daniels may have vanished into legend, but her spirit continues to walk among us, inspiring courage in those who face their own moments of choice between submission and resistance, safety and dignity, survival and true freedom. In the end, perhaps that is the most important truth about Ruth Daniels. Not the specific details of her life or death, but the enduring power of her example to inspire others to choose courage over comfort, justice over security, human dignity over mere survival. Her story belongs not only to the past, but to every present moment when individuals must decide how much they are willing to sacrifice for the sake of their fundamental humanity. And in that sense, Ruth Daniels walks among us still, her bare feet silent on the roads that lead toward freedom, her face turned toward whatever future we have the courage to create. The investigation into Ruth's disappearance continued long after the initial search parties had given up hope of finding her. Detective William Crawford, a meticulous man who had built his reputation on solving cases that others considered hopeless, became obsessed with understanding how a shackled woman could vanish from a locked cell without leaving any trace of her escape route. He interviewed every guard, examined every stone in the jail's construction, and tested every lock and bar for signs of tampering or weakness. Crawford's personal journals, discovered in his family's attic nearly a century later, revealed a man slowly coming to question everything he had believed about the natural order of society. His initial assumption that Ruth must have received outside help gradually gave way to a more disturbing possibility, that perhaps the entire system of bondage was more fragile than anyone had imagined. If one determined woman could simply walk away from chains and locked doors, what did that suggest about the thousands of others who remained in captivity? The detective's investigation led him into parts of Savannah he had never explored, the hidden networks of communication that connected enslaved communities across the region. He began to understand that beneath the visible surface of plantation society lay another world entirely, one where information traveled through songs and stories, where resistance took forms that the dominant culture could not recognize or prevent. Ruth Daniels had not acted in isolation, he realized, but as part of the larger pattern of defiance that had always existed alongside the institution of slavery. In 1854, 2 years after Ruth's disappearance, Crawford received an anonymous letter that changed the direction of his investigation entirely. The message, written in careful script on expensive paper, contained only a few lines. "She walks the freedom roads now. The ancestors called her home. Look not for the living among the dead, nor the free among the chained." The letter was signed with a simple drawing of a crossroads, the same symbol that had begun appearing scratched into trees and carved into fence posts throughout the countryside. Crawford traced the paper to a stationery shop in Charleston, but proprietor claimed no memory of selling such expensive stock to anyone who might have written the letter. The ink was of a type commonly available throughout the region, offering no clues about its origin. Most frustrating of all, the handwriting showed characteristics that suggested education and refinement, the kind of penmanship typically associated with wealthy white society rather than the enslaved population that Crawford suspected was protecting Ruth's secret. The detective's search for answers led him to interview Ezra, an elderly man who had worked as a blacksmith on various plantations throughout the Low Country. Ezra had earned a reputation for wisdom and discretion, the kind of person that both enslaved and free members of the community turned to for advice during difficult times. He listened carefully to Crawford's questions, his weathered hands folded in his lap, his eyes focused on some distant point beyond the detective's shoulder. "Some chains are made of iron," Ezra said finally, his voice carrying the cadence of someone who had learned to speak carefully around white authority. "Other chains are made of fear, of habit, of believing what you've been told about your place in this world. The strongest chains are the ones we put on ourselves." Detective Crawford Ruth Daniels. She found a way to break all her chains, not just the iron ones. Crawford pressed for more specific information about Ruth's possible escape route or current whereabouts. But Ezra simply shook his head with what might have been sympathy for the detective's confusion. "You looking for her in all the wrong places," he said. "Ruth Daniels ain't hiding nowhere. You can find her with bloodhounds and wanted posters. She done walked right out of the world you understand into a world you can't see." The conversation haunted Crawford for months afterward, challenging his fundamental assumptions about reality and causation. He was a man of facts and evidence, someone who believed that every mystery had a rational solution waiting to be discovered through careful investigation. Yet, the more he learned about Ruth Daniels and the circumstances of her disappearance, the more he found himself confronting possibilities that lay beyond the boundaries of his materialistic worldview. Other strange incidents began occurring throughout the region during the months following Ruth's vanishing. Enslaved people reported dreams of a woman in a dark dress who appeared to them with messages of hope and encouragement, urging them to maintain their courage and dignity in the face of oppression. Some claim to have seen her walking the roads at night, always moving away from populated areas toward the wilderness that offered both danger and possibility of freedom. These sightings followed a consistent pattern that troubled local authorities. Ruth was always described as walking alone, showing no fear of the dangers that typically kept people indoors after dark. Wild animals seemed to avoid her presence, and even the most vicious plantation dogs reportedly fell silent when she passed their territory. Most unsettling of all, several witnesses claimed that she left no footprints in mud or sand, moving across the landscape without disturbing the earth beneath her feet. Martha, a young woman who worked as a seamstress in one of Savannah's finest houses, swore that Ruth had appeared to her during a particularly difficult period when her master had threatened to sell her children to settle gambling debts. According to Martha's account, Ruth had materialized beside her bed in the servants' quarters, her presence bringing a sense of calm that seemed to radiate outward like warmth from a fire. She didn't say nothing at first. Martha later told her closest friends and whispered conversations that took place far from any white ears. "Just sat there beside me while I cried about my babies being taken away. Then she put her hand on my shoulder, and I felt this strength flow into me like I was drawing water from a deep well I didn't know was there. She told me that no chains could hold a mother's love, that there were ways to protect what mattered most if I had the courage to act." The next morning, Martha had awakened with detailed knowledge of the underground railroad routes that led north toward freedom, information she could not explain, but somehow trusted completely. Within a week, she and her children had vanished from their master's house, leaving no trace of their escape route or destination. The plantation owner offered substantial rewards for their return, but no amount of money seemed sufficient to produce information about their whereabouts or the identity of those who had helped them disappear. Similar stories emerged from plantations throughout Georgia and South Carolina, always following the same pattern of desperate people receiving mysterious assistance that enabled them to escape bondage. The Underground Railroad had operated in the region for decades, but suddenly its activities seemed to intensify, as if inspired by some new source of courage and determination. Local newspapers began reporting an alarming increase in runaway slaves with success rates that defied explanation given the extensive network of patrols and informants that typically prevented such escapes. Dr. Harrison, the physician who had tried unsuccessfully to understand Ruth's motives, found himself drawn into the mystery despite his better judgment. As a man of science and rational thought, he rejected supernatural explanations for the events occurring around him. Yet, he could not deny the evidence of dramatic changes taking place throughout the enslaved Ra community. People who had previously accepted their circumstances with resignation were suddenly displaying levels of hope and defiance that seemed to emerge from nowhere. The doctor began keeping detailed records of the phenomena he observed, approaching the situation with the same methodical attention he applied to medical diagnosis. He interviewed plantation owners about changes in their workers' behavior, documented reports of supernatural encounters, and tried to identify patterns that might reveal natural explanations for seemingly impossible events. His private journals reveal a man struggling to reconcile his scientific training with experiences that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality. One entry dated October 15, 1853, exactly 1 year after Margaret Whittaker's murder, described Harrison's own encounter with what he could only describe as Ruth's apparition. He had been traveling alone between plantations when his horse suddenly stopped on a deserted stretch of road, refusing to proceed despite his efforts to encourage forward movement. In the moonlight ahead, he saw a figure in dark clothing walking across the path, moving with the same purposeful stride that multiple witnesses had described in their accounts. "I called out to her," Harrison wrote, thinking perhaps she was some lost traveler in need of assistance. "But when she turned toward me, I recognized immediately the face I had seen in the Whittaker ballroom on that terrible night. Her eyes held the same calm determination, the same absence of fear that had marked her demeanor during the trial. She regarded me for a long moment, as if evaluating something about my character or intentions." According to Harrison's account, Ruth had spoken only a few words during their encounter, but her message haunted him for the rest of his life. "The harvest is not finished, Dr. Harrison," she had said, her voice carrying clearly through the night air. "What was planted in pain will be reaped in freedom, though the season be longer than any of us imagined." Then she had continued walking into the darkness, leaving Harrison alone with his frightened horse and a growing understanding that the world contained mysteries beyond his ability to comprehend or explain. The doctor's encounter marked a turning point in his own life and career. Previously content to treat the symptoms of a social system he had never seriously questioned, Harrison began using his medical practice as a cover for activities that would have shocked his wealthy patients. He treated injuries sustained during escape attempts without reporting them to authorities, provided medicine and supplies to Underground Railroad conductors, and used his social position to spread disinformation about the movement of runaways through the region. Years later, in letters discovered after his death, Harrison acknowledged that his meeting with Ruth Daniels had fundamentally altered his understanding of moral responsibility and human dignity. "She showed me that neutrality in the face of evil is itself a form of evil," he wrote to his brother in Boston. "I had thought myself a good man because I treated my own slaves kindly and committed no obvious cruelties. But goodness requires more than mere absence of malice. It demands active opposition to injustice wherever we can encounter it." The influence of Ruth's story spread far beyond the immediate region where she had lived and died. Abolitionists in the North seized upon her narrative, as evidence of the inherent violence of the slavery system, arguing that desperation could drive even the most docile servants to acts of deadly resistance. Pro-slavery advocates countered by portraying her as an example of the savage nature that supposedly lay beneath the surface of all African Americans, evidence of why strict control was necessary for the safety of white society. Frederick Douglass, the renowned orator and former slave, addressed Ruth's story in several of his speeches during the 1850s. He rejected both the abolitionist and pro-slavery interpretations, instead presenting her as a fully human individual who had been driven to extreme action by extreme circumstances. Ruth Daniels was not a savage or a saint, he told audiences in Boston and Philadelphia. She was a woman who chose to assert her humanity in the only way left available to her, knowing full well the consequences of that choice. Douglass's speeches about Ruth emphasized the psychological toll of enslavement, the daily erosion of dignity and self-respect that occurred when human beings were treated as property rather than people. He argued that her act of violence, while tragic, was the inevitable result of a system that denied enslaved people any legitimate means of seeking justice or protection from abuse. When all legal remedies are denied, he declared, when appeals to conscience fall on deaf ears, when human dignity is daily trampled underfoot, then violent resistance becomes not only understandable, morally justified. The debate over Ruth's actions and their broader implications continued throughout the decade leading up to the Civil War, contributing to the growing polarization between North and South over the slavery question. Her story became a touchstone for discussions about the nature of resistance, the limits of endurance, and the circumstances under which violence might be considered justified. Both sides claimed her as support for their positions, but neither seemed to grasp the full complexity of her situation or the multiple factors that had led to her moment of desperate action. Meanwhile, the mysterious disappearances of enslaved people throughout the region continued at an unprecedented rate. Plantation owners invested increasing resources and security measures, building higher walls, posting more guards, and offering larger rewards for information about escape routes. Yet their efforts seemed futile against whatever force was inspiring in assisting the runaways. Some began to whisper that supernatural powers were at work, that the spirits of Africa had somehow awakened to reclaim their stolen children. These fears were not entirely unfounded, as traditional spiritual practices had indeed intensified throughout the enslaved communities during the years following Ruth's disappearance. Conjure women and root doctors reported increased demand for protective charms and guidance rituals as people saw connection with ancestral wisdom that might help them navigate the dangerous path toward freedom. The boundary between Christian faith and older traditions became increasingly blurred, creating syncretic practices that drew strength from multiple sources. Celia, an elderly woman respected throughout the region for her knowledge of herbal medicine and spiritual practices, became a focal point for those seeking to understand the changes occurring in their world. Born in Africa and brought to America as a young girl, she retained memories of homeland traditions that most American-born slaves had lost or forgotten. Her small cabin on the outskirts of a rice plantation became a pilgrimage site for those seeking guidance and inspiration. Ruth didn't disappear. Celia explained to visitors who came seeking answers about the mysterious escape. She transformed like the butterfly that leaves behind its earthly form to fly on wings of air and light. The spirits of our ancestors called her home, not to death, but to a different kind of life, one where chains cannot hold and masters cannot command. She walks between the worlds now, helping others find their own path to transformation. Celia's teachings emphasized the power of spiritual resistance alongside physical escape, encouraging people to maintain their inner freedom even when external circumstances remained unchanged. She taught that Ruth's story was not unique, but part of a larger pattern of sacrifice and transformation that had occurred throughout the history of their people. Every generation produced individuals who chose to pay the ultimate price for asserting their humanity, and their sacrifice created pathways that others could follow toward liberation. The spiritual interpretation of Ruth's disappearance provided comfort and inspiration to people who might otherwise have despaired of ever achieving freedom. It suggested that resistance took many forms, not all of them visible to those who sought to maintain control through violence and intimidation. The idea that Ruth continued to exist in some form, actively helping others escape bondage, gave hope to those who faced seemingly impossible circumstances. By 1858, the legend of Ruth Daniels had spread throughout the South and beyond, carried by the complex networks of communication that connected enslaved communities across vast distances. Her story was told in different versions depending on the audience and context, but certain elements remained consistent. Her calm demeanor during the murder and trial, her mysterious disappearance from a locked cell, and her continued presence as a helper and guide for those seeking freedom. The approaching presidential election of 1860 brought new urgency to discussions about slavery and its future in American society. Abraham Lincoln's nomination by the Republican Party on a platform opposing the expansion of slavery into new territories sent shock waves through the South, where political leaders began seriously considering secession as a response to what they saw as Northern aggression against their way of life. The specter of Ruth Daniels haunted these discussions, serving as a reminder of the violence that lay just beneath the surface of apparently peaceful plantation society. In Charleston, where Ruth had been born and spent her early years, a group of free blacks organized a secret memorial service to honor her memory and the memory of all those who had died in the struggle for freedom. The ceremony took place in a cemetery where unmarked graves held the remains of enslaved people who had lived and died in bondage. Their names forgotten by history, but their suffering remembered by those who shared their Omar heritage. The service was led by Benjamin, a carpenter who had purchased his own freedom through years of skilled labor and careful saving. He had never met Ruth personally, but her story had inspired him to use his relative's security and resources to help others achieve what he had accomplished through luck and determination. His woodworking shop served as a secret station on the Underground Railroad, providing temporary shelter and supplies for runaways heading north toward uncertain but hopeful futures. Ruth Daniels showed us that freedom cannot be granted by others. Benjamin told the small congregation gathered among the weathered headstones, it must be claimed by each individual through their own choices and actions. She chose to die free rather than live in chains, and that choice echoes through all of us who carried her memory. We honor her not by seeking revenge against those who oppressed her, but by ensuring that her sacrifice contributes to the eventual liberation of our entire Con people. The memorial service concluded with the singing of spirituals that had emerged during the years since Ruth's disappearance, songs that spoke of crossing over to freedom and finding rest from earthly troubles. These musical traditions carried coded messages about escape routes and safe houses, information that could be transmitted openly without arousing the suspicions of those who heard only religious expression rather than practical guidance for fugitive slaves. As 1860 dawned, the United States stood on the brink of civil war, though few people fully understood the magnitude of the conflict that was approaching. The election of Lincoln triggered the secession crisis that political leaders had long feared, as Southern states began withdrawing from the Union in response to what they perceived as an existential threat to their economic and social s. Ruth Daniels had been dead or transformed for 8 years, but her story continued to influence the debate over slavery and freedom that would soon be settled through 4 years of devastating warfare. The first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, not far from where Ruth had been born into bondage decades earlier. As Union and Confederate forces prepared for what both sides expected to be a brief and decisive conflict, enslaved people throughout the South began to sense that the world was about to change in ways that might finally fulfill the promise implicit in Ruth's act of defiant resistance. Frederick Douglass, now one of the most prominent voices advocating for the complete abolition of slavery, spoke frequently about the war's potential to achieve what individual acts of resistance like Ruth's had been unable to accomplish on their own. The harvest that Ruth Daniels began with her act of desperate courage, he declared in a speech delivered in New York, will now be completed by the combined actions of millions of people, both black and white, who have finally recognized that this nation cannot survive half slave and half free. The war years brought unprecedented opportunities for enslaved people to escape bondage, as the collapse of normal social order created chaos that could be exploited by those seeking freedom. Hundreds of thousands fled to Union lines where they found protection and the possibility of new lives as free people. Many of these refugees carried stories of Ruth Daniels passed down through family networks and community traditions, tales that had provided hope during the darkest years of their captivity. Among these refugees was Sarah, a woman in her 40s who had worked as a cook on a plantation near Savannah. She claimed to be Ruth's cousin, though the relationship was impossible to verify given the scattered nature of family records among enslaved people. Sarah's version of Ruth's story differed in some details from other accounts, but it shared the essential elements that had made the narrative so powerful and enduring within the community. According to Sarah, Ruth had not been acting alone on the night she killed Margaret Whittaker, but had been part of a larger conspiracy involving several other enslaved people who had planned simultaneous acts of dacial resistance throughout the region. The plan had called for coordinated uprisings that would create enough chaos to allow mass escapes, but Ruth's premature action had forced the others to abandon their preparations and flee before they could carry out their own ball assignments. This version of events suggested that Ruth's disappearance from jail had been accomplished through the assistance of her co-conspirators, who had used their knowledge of the building's construction and guard routines to facilitate her escape. Sarah claimed that Ruth had been hidden in a network of safe houses throughout the countryside before eventually making her way to freedom in Canada, where she had lived under an assumed name until her natural death in the early years of the war. Whether or not Sarah's account was accurate, it provided a more naturalistic explanation for Ruth's mysterious disappearance while maintaining the essential power of her story as an example of resistance against oppression. The idea that Ruth had not acted alone, but as part of a larger movement, suggested that individual acts of defiance were connected to broader patterns of resistance that had always existed within enslaved communities, even when they remained invisible to outside observers. The end of the Civil War in 1865 brought legal freedom to 4 million enslaved people throughout the former Confederacy, but the struggle for true equality and justice was far from over. The Reconstruction era that followed the war saw both remarkable progress and violent backlash as newly freed people worked to build lives and communities while facing continued oppression from those who refused to accept the new social order. Ruth Daniels' story took on new significance during this period, serving as a reminder that freedom required constant vigilance and sometimes demanded the ultimate sacrifice from those who sought to preserve it. The Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist organizations that emerged during Reconstruction used violence and intimidation to reimpose white supremacy, creating circumstances that in some ways paralleled the antebellum conditions that had driven Ruth to her act of desperate resistance. In 1868, a freedman named Joshua organized a ceremony to dedicate a small monument to Ruth's memory in a cemetery outside Savannah, where formerly enslaved people had begun burying their dead with arenino, dignity and proper marking. The simple granite stone bore only her name and the dates of her birth and presumed death along with a brief inscription. She chose freedom over fear. The dedication ceremony was attended by dozens of people who had known Ruth personally or heard her story from others, creating one of the first public acknowledgments of her significance in the history of resistance to Bateen slavery. The monument became a gathering place for annual commemorations that continued throughout the late 19th century, even as the initial optimism of Reconstruction gave way to the systematic crawls, disenfranchisement and segregation of the Jim Crow era. Each October 15th, on the anniversary of Margaret Whittaker's murder, people would gather to share stories, sing spirituals, and reflect on the ongoing struggle for true freedom and equality. These commemorations helped preserve Ruth's story through the difficult decades that followed the end of Reconstruction, ensuring that her example of courageous resistance would not be forgotten even as legal and social progress stalled or reversed. The participants came to understand that Ruth's significance lay not only in her individual act of defiance, but in her representation of the larger community of people who had refused to accept dehumanization and oppression as their permanent condition. As the 20th century dawned, Ruth Daniels had been dead or vanished for nearly 50 years, but her story continued to evolve and influence new generations of people struggling for justice and human dignity. The Great Migration that saw millions of African Americans leave the South for opportunities in northern and western cities, carried her narrative to new audiences where it found fresh relevance in urban contexts far removed from the plantation society where it had originated. In Chicago and Detroit, New York, and Los Angeles, community organizations and churches incorporated Ruth's story into their teachings about pride, resistance, and the long history of struggle that had brought their people from slavery to citizenship. Her example inspired civil rights activists who faced violence and intimidation in their efforts to achieve full equality under law, providing historical context for their own courage and determination. The story of Ruth Daniels thus transcended its original historical context to become a timeless testament to the human capacity for resistance against oppression. Regardless of the specific forms that oppression might take, her legacy lived on not only in the mysterious sightings and spiritual encounters that continued to be reported in rural Georgia, but in the hearts and minds of people everywhere who understood that true freedom sometimes requires the willingness to risk everything for the sake of human dignity and justice. During the 1920s, a young anthropologist named Rebecca Williams arrived in Savannah to conduct research on folk traditions in the coastal regions of Georgia and South Carolina. Williams, one of the first African-American women to earn a doctorate from Columbia University, had been commissioned by the Harlem Renaissance intellectual movement to document stories and customs that might otherwise be lost as rural communities modernized and dispersed. Her work would prove instrumental in preserving Ruth's story for future generations. Williams spent 3 years traveling throughout the Low Country, recording interviews with elderly residents who remembered the antebellum period and its aftermath. Many of her subjects were reluctant to speak openly about their experiences during slavery, having learned through bitter experience that such conversations could bring unwanted attention from hostile authorities. However, Williams's academic credentials and respectful approach gradually earned their trust, allowing her to collect detailed accounts that had never been formally documented. Among her most valuable interviews was a lengthy conversation with Moses, a man in his 90s, who claimed to have worked alongside Ruth in the Whittaker household during the months leading up to Margaret's murder. Moses had been the stable master responsible for caring for the family's horses and maintaining their carriages, a position that gave him unique insights into the rhythms and tensions of the plantation's daily operations. According to Moses, Ruth had been planning some form of resistance for weeks before the harvest festival, though she had shared her specific intentions with no one. She'd been different for a while, he told Williams, his weathered hands gesturing as he searched for words to describe changes he had noticed, but not fully understood at the time. Quieter than usual, but not in a scared way, more like she was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear, waiting for some kind of sign. Moses described subtle shifts in Ruth's behavior that had become apparent only in retrospect. Small actions that suggested she was preparing for a dramatic change in her circumstances. She had begun giving away personal possessions to other enslaved people, claiming she no longer needed certain items, but never explaining why. Her cooking had become more elaborate and carefully prepared, as if she were trying to leave behind examples of her finest work. Most significantly, she had started spending time in the plantation's small cemetery, standing silently beside graves of enslaved people who had died over the years. The night it happened, Moses continued, I was in the stables when I heard all the commotion from the big house. By the time I got there, Ruth was already being led away in chains. But she turned and looked right at me as they passed by. Her eyes were the calmest I'd ever seen them, but she'd finally found the answer to some question that had been troubling her for years. She nodded at me just once, and I knew she was saying goodbye to more than just the plantation. Williams' research revealed that Ruth's story had evolved considerably during the decades since her disappearance, with different communities emphasizing different aspects of her narrative, depending on their experiences and needs. In some versions, she appeared as a vengeful spirit who punished cruel masters and overseers, striking fear into the hearts of those who mistreated enslaved people. Other accounts portrayed her as a protective guardian who helped runaways find safe passage to freedom, appearing at crucial moments to provide guidance and encouragement. The academic study of Ruth's legend coincided with a broader cultural movement during the Harlem Renaissance that sought to reclaim and celebrate American history and identity. Writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston drew inspiration from folk traditions that included stories like Ruth's incorporating themes of resistance and transformation into literature that reached national audiences. Ruth's narrative found new expression in poems, plays and novels that explored the psychological and spiritual dimensions of her choice. One particularly influential work was a one-act play titled The Harvest Moon, written by playwright Augusta Baker and first performed in 1926 at the Lafayette Theatre in Harlem. The play dramatized Ruth's final night in the Whittaker household, focusing on her internal struggle as she prepared to take action that would end both her mistress's life and her own existence as she had known it. Baker's interpretation emphasized Ruth's agency and intelligence, portraying her not as a victim driven to madness, but as a rational woman who had carefully considered her limited options and chosen the path that preserved her dignity. The Harvest Moon was performed throughout the 1920s and 30s by theater groups in cities with significant African-American populations, bringing Ruth's story to audiences who might never have encountered it through oral tradition. The play's success inspired other artistic interpretations, including a blues song by Mississippi Delta musician Robert Washington that became popular throughout the South during the Depression era. Washington's song titled Ruth's Walking Blues told her story through the metaphorical language typical of blues tradition, describing a woman who walked away from her earthly chains and continued walking down that freedom road. The song's refrain, "Ruth keeps walking, never looking back. Her bare feet finding the righteous track," became widely recognized throughout African-American communities, ensuring that her story remained alive in popular culture as well as academic discourse. The Great Depression of the 1930s brought new relevance to Ruth's story, as economic hardship forced many people to confront situations where conventional solutions seemed inadequate or impossible. Her example of choosing extreme action over continued subjugation resonated with individuals and communities facing desperate circumstances, providing a historical precedent for resistance against overwhelming odds. During this period, a group of elderly women in rural Georgia began meeting regularly at the small monument that had been erected to Ruth's memory in the 1860s. These gatherings, which came to be known as Ruth's Circle, combined elements of prayer meeting, storytelling session, and mutual support group. The participants, many of whom were granddaughters or great-granddaughters of enslaved people, found strength and inspiration in sharing memories and reflecting on the ongoing struggle for equality and justice. Mother Sarah Johnson, the acknowledged leader of Ruth's Circle, had been born into slavery in 1858 and retained vivid memories of the stories she had heard as a child about Ruth's mysterious disappearance and continued presence in the community. Now, Mother Johnson served as a repository of oral tradition and a source of wisdom for younger generations who were navigating the challenges of life in the Jim Crow South. Ruth didn't just kill her mistress that night. Mother Johnson would tell visitors who came seeking to understand the significance of their gatherings. She killed something inside herself that had been keeping her bound up in fear and submission. That's the real miracle of her story, not whether she walked through locked doors or turned into a spirit. She found the courage to become who she really was regardless of what it cost her. The women of Ruth's Circle developed their own rituals and practices centered around her memory, including an annual ceremony on October 15th that involved lighting candles, sharing food, and telling stories about resistance and survival. These gatherings attracted attention from folklorists and religious scholars who were interested in documenting the evolution of African-American spiritual traditions in the post-slavery era. Dr. Marcus Thompson, a professor of theology at Atlanta University, spent several years studying the religious dimensions of Ruth's legacy during the late 1930s. His research revealed how her story had been incorporated into various forms of Christian worship, particularly in rural churches where congregations blended traditional Protestant theology with older African spiritual practices. Ruth appeared in sermons as an example of righteous anger against injustice. Her violent action reinterpreted through biblical precedents of divinely sanctioned resistance to oppression. Thompson's work documented several churches where Ruth was explicitly venerated as a martyr and saint, her image appearing in handmade artwork and her story retold during special services dedicated to honoring those who had died in the struggle for freedom. These practices represented a significant departure from mainstream Christian teaching, which typically condemned violence even in response to extreme provocation, but they provided comfort and inspiration to communities that had experienced generations of brutality and dehumanization. The outbreak of World War II brought new contexts for understanding Ruth's story as Americans confronted the reality of systematic genocide and institutionalized evil on a global scale. The Holocaust and other Nazi atrocities forced difficult questions about the moral obligations of individuals living under oppressive systems, creating parallels that some observers drew to the circumstances that had driven Ruth to her desperate action. American soldiers serving in the segregated military found particular relevance in Ruth's example as they fought against fascism abroad while continuing to face discrimination and violence at home. Her story circulated through military camps and overseas deployments carried by soldiers who understood the contradiction of being asked to die for freedom while being denied full citizenship in their own base country. Sergeant William Davis, a combat veteran who had served with distinction in the European theater, returned home to Georgia in 1945 with a new perspective on Ruth's legacy. In letters to his family, he described how her story had sustained him during the darkest moments of the war, providing a connection to his historical roots and a reminder that resistance to evil was both necessary and honorable. Ruth Daniels showed us that sometimes you have to choose between survival and dignity. Davis wrote to his sister from a military hospital in France, where he was recovering from wounds received during the Battle of the Bulge. She chose dignity, and that choice echoes through all of us who carry her memory. I've seen what happens when good people do nothing in the face of evil, and I understand now why she couldn't just accept her situation and dar hope for better times. The post-war period brought significant changes to American society, including the beginning of the modern civil rights movement that would eventually dismantle the legal foundations of segregation and discrimination. Ruth's story found new audiences among activists who drew inspiration from her example of individual resistance while working to build collective movements for social change. Rosa Parks, whose refusal to give up her bus seat in Montgomery sparked one of the most important campaigns of the civil rights era, later acknowledged Ruth's influence on her own decision to resist unjust authority. In interviews conducted decades after the Montgomery bus boycott, Parks described how stories of historical resistance had shaped her understanding of what was possible when individuals chose to act according to their conscience rather than accepting discriminatory treatment. Ruth Daniels paid the ultimate price for asserting her humanity, Parks reflected in a 1985 interview with civil rights historian Taylor Branch. Her story reminded me that freedom isn't something that's given to us by others. It's something we claim for ourselves through our choices and actions. When I sat in that seat on the bus, I was following a path that she and countless others had walked before me, even if their stories weren't always recorded in the boss history books. The 1960s brought renewed academic interest in Ruth's story, as historians began examining slavery and resistance from new perspectives that emphasized the agency and complexity of enslaved people's responses to their circumstances. Scholars like Herbert Atherere and Eugene Genovese challenged traditional narratives that portrayed enslaved people as passive victims, instead documenting the various forms of resistance that had existed throughout the antebellum period. Dr. Angela Davis, the radical activist and scholar, wrote extensively about Ruth's significance during this period, arguing that her story illustrated the connections between individual acts of error, violence, and broader patterns of systematic oppression. Davis's analysis placed Ruth's actions within the context of justified resistance to institutionalized brutality, challenging readers to consider the moral implications of condemning violence by the oppressed while accepting violence by their oppressors. Ruth Daniels understood something that many of her contemporaries could not see. Davis wrote in her influential 1972 essay, Violence and Liberation in the Slave South. She recognized that the violence of slavery was not confined to physical brutality, but extended to every aspect of daily life under bondage. Her response was not irrational or savage, but rather a logical conclusion drawn from the premise that human dignity cannot coexist with systematic dehumanization. The civil rights movement's success in dismantling legal segregation did not end the relevance of Ruth's story, as new forms of inequality and injustice continued to affect African American communities throughout the late 20th century. Her example inspired activists working on issues ranging from criminal justice reform to economic inequality, providing historical context for contemporary struggles against institutional bowel, racism, and structural oppression. During the 1980s, a group of community organizers in Savannah established the Ruth Daniels Freedom School, an alternative educational program designed to teach African American children about their historical heritage and the ongoing struggle for equality and justice. The school's curriculum emphasized critical thinking and social activism, encouraging students to see themselves as part of a continuing tradition of resistance that stretched back through generations of their ancestors. The Freedom School's founder, Dr. Patricia Washington, had been inspired by Ruth's story as a child growing up in rural Georgia during the 1950s and 60s. Her grandmother, a member of the original Ruth Circle, had shared the oral traditions that preserved Ruth's memory within the local community, instilling in young Patricia a sense of connection to this powerful example of courage, and determination. Ruth Daniels represents the best of our people. Dr. Washington explained to parents considering enrollment in the Freedom School, she shows us that even under the worst circumstances, we have choices about how to respond to injustice and oppression. We can't always control what happens to us, but we can control how we react. And sometimes our reaction becomes an inspiration for others who are facing similar challenges." End quote. The Freedom School operated for more than 20 years, serving hundreds of students who carried Ruth's story into their adult lives as teachers, activists, and community leaders. Many of these alumni went on to establish similar programs in other cities, spreading both Ruth's narrative and the educational philosophy it had inspired to new audiences throughout the United States. As the 20th century drew to a close, Ruth Daniels had been dead or transformed for nearly 150 years. But her influence continued to expand through new forms of media and communication. The Internet allowed her story to reach global audiences, where it found resonance among people struggling against various forms of oppression and injustice in countries around the world. A website dedicated to preserving and sharing Ruth's story was established in 1998 by a coalition of historians, activists, and community organizations. The site featured historical documents, scholarly articles, artistic interpretations, and personal reflections from visitors who found meaning in her example. Over time, it became a gathering place for people seeking to connect Ruth's 19th century resistance to contemporary movements for social justice and human rights. The dawn of the 21st century brought new challenges and opportunities for keeping Ruth's memory alive in an increasingly complex and interconnected world. Her story continued to evolve as each generation discovered fresh relevance in her choice to prioritize dignity over survival, resistance over submission, truth over comfort. Whether viewed as historical fact, spiritual metaphor, or inspirational legend, Ruth Daniels remained a powerful symbol of the human capacity to transcend circumstances and assert fundamental worth in the face of systematic dehumanization.